I'm Dr. Pete Economo, the East Coast psychologist.
And I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin, the West Coast psychologist.
And this is When East
Meets West.
Well, another exciting guest and opportunity here at When East Meets West. Nikki, this is a good one.
I know. I'm really excited because I just got to chat with our guest a little bit, and I'd watched his TED Talk. Anyway, I'm really excited about today because I think I'm going to learn a lot.
Well, today we have with us Gene Semelfort Jr. He is a licensed professional counselor. And what I will say is he is a dear friend, colleague, and I have had the privilege to supervise and watch Gene grow. He's currently practicing at his own private practice called Cactus. And what I really love about the Cactus Center, New Jersey, and I'm going to maybe ask him to explain it, but it is the cactus came to mind because we're developing tougher skin and spikes to protect ourselves from problematic situations. He has a TED Talk on toxic masculinity, and he's a consultant for many universities in the New Jersey area, of which I'm very familiar with because I have tapped him many times to come help me with some of the teams I work with. So, Gene, welcome to When East Meets West.
Thank you both for having me. It's a pleasure to be on this show and speak to the both of you. But yeah, Pete and I go way back, way back. So
well, it's not that long.
Pete's always like, "Don't age me, don't age me."
It's not that long, but I mean it. It was so, Gene. You know, I thank you for this, and it's so great that we're still here. And you know, like Nikki said, we're just thankful to learn today. We're both looking to learn from you. And, you know, maybe where do you want to start? Do you want to start with just defining toxic masculinity or how you got into this work?
So I mean, I could start by just describing how I got into this work in particular. So I'm the youngest of three. So I have two older sisters that are twins. Mm-hmm. And I was raised in a household with myself, my two older sisters, and my mother. And so when I tell folks that I had to hear a problem, I heard it 3 times if I did something problematic. So it was, and there's a 9-year difference. So I'm almost like a only child slash younger sibling. But nonetheless, I've witnessed a great deal of interpersonal violence that my sisters and my mother have sustained, abuse in many different forms, in many different ways. And so for myself, I felt always helpless in some ways because I was the younger brother, and I'm small in stature. So this idea of being physically menacing or protective wasn't a part of my tool set. So one of the things I learned was to be sort of compassionate and empathetic and supportive to my sisters. But in that process, I've been super sensitive around gender, just kind of gender expectations, gender stereotypes, gender norms, things that sort. And I've carried that with me throughout my career. And it wasn't until probably undergrad that I started really exploring my own gender. I had those feelings, but I never had the word or vernacular or theological explanations to really describe my own personal experiences. But it was working in a women's center at Ramapo College where I got my start and my introduction to Black feminist thought and theory. And all of those things just felt like a check mark on a checklist. It was like, yes. Yes. So I connected very much so with it. And I think from then it just kind of went on to the point that I've tried to incorporate it in my clinical practice. And in anything that I do, I'm very particular to just identities in general and the intersections of them.
That's wonderful. And I'm always so appreciative when especially a clinician is willing to share about how their own personal experience has informed their lens and the work that they do, because, obviously Pete and I talk a lot about this. I'm sure you guys have had many conversations about context. Context is everything, especially from a behavioral science lens. And, I'm always sort of perplexed when clinicians are willful around discussing and getting curious and identifying how their own context informs how they think about things and what they bring to their work. So I really appreciate you not only, of course, actively using that to inform what you do, but to talk about it.
Of course. I mean, it's necessary, right?
Yeah. I think so. I think so. Yeah.
And I'm sitting here wondering, how many people would be confused by that? Because I'm also wondering if you share, because obviously it's a podcast, not everyone can see. So Nikki and I, when we talk about privilege, we'll be like, we're two white people for those that maybe can't tell. Like, I wonder if you maybe if you would talk a little bit about your identities and how gender, because I'm thinking that there might be like another man out there being like, well, how is a man thinking about gender and studying Black feminist theory?
Yeah, I mean, it's I think I share it in the sense of just recognizing that disclosure to some extent has some power. Of course, right, in clinical practice, but I do think it creates it humanizes the individual that's providing the services
Yeah.
to that person, which I think in many ways breaks down that barrier and allows for just relation and connection.
Yeah.
So if folks could kind of see me talk about and reflect on gender and understand what impassioned me to kind of come into this work, then I think they're more likely to sort of connect with it. But I also think it informs my work significantly, and I have to be cognizant of gender because in many respects, gender plays a part in some of these attributes and characteristics and belief systems that we particularly internalize because they've been sort of we've been bombarded with them in so many ways to the point where we almost feel that a part of our survival is to hold on to these things. So I think it just feels essential, right, to really identify like who I am as a person, not just kind of my presenting identities that maybe can be assumed in some ways, but just who I am, right?
Yeah.
Your values, who you are. Yes, totally.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, and Jean, I'm wondering if kind of going off of that, if because I think now would maybe be a really helpful time if you could define for our listeners some of these belief systems that you're alluding to that kind of exist in the world, so if we could actually talk really concretely about toxic masculinity, because I think, I know that's I would say like maybe that's a little bit more in the sort of like lexicon of the world now. Like some people sort of hear it a little bit more, which is helpful, right? And I would say it's more newly utilized. That some people might be listening, going like, "What does that mean, toxic masculinity?"
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I think there's varying definitions of toxic masculinity that exist, right? And some people might not even use toxic; they'll use traditional or hegemonic as a description. But I think the part of the toxicity is more so what characteristics that are existing within toxic masculinity that we're holding on to that impact sort of our own how do you say, our own development, our own health, but also our interpersonal skills and relationships with others. So in the toxicity piece that I like to describe it is that I'm holding on to these characteristics so much that I myself feel am suffering from the toxicity of those characteristics, but then those around me are also being poisoned by the kind of toxicity that's emanating from my pores, right, to some degree. And some of those characteristics tend to be things like, I mean, the age-old thing like boys don't cry, men don't cry, we don't express emotions, almost dominating particular pieces where I have to dominate in every space. I have to present as intellectual. I have to be a master of all things. I have to be handy, right? Or if we become nah. Well, you know what? Interesting enough, I think I've observed it a lot. So I can do it if I need to do it, but I don't want to do it.
If there was, I only ask because I'm not, and you're right. Like if there was a gun to my head, maybe I could hang a shelf, but I'd rather just have someone else do it because I know it's not going to fall if someone else hangs it. But if I hang it, it might fall. But I appreciate that example, and I think that people will connect with that. And then, what about intersectionality then? Because I think before we dive deeper into masculinity, you mentioned this term intersectionality, and I'm thinking, Nikki, that's probably like in that similar lexicon world.
I totally agree with that. People hear it and people are like, I kind of maybe get a sense of what that means, but maybe don't sort of haven't been given the opportunity to really hear like the definition of that.
No, absolutely. So the intersectionality was a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. And so the way in which it was described is that all of us hold various identities. Right. And so if you meet at kind of the intersection of these identities, you'll find particular things. So if you're imagining going to, like, if you're going to someone's home and they say, oh, I'm on 16th Street intersecting with like 8th Avenue in some way. Right. And so there you can kind of pinpoint them. And I think in family systems, they may be referred to as like social locators in some ways. And so it's these varying identities that we hold, but also add nuance and additional flavor to maybe specific experiences. So for example, if I'm talking about masculinities, recognizing that there are various forms and expressions of masculinity. And so there isn't just one, although all of them across the board may hold similarities, but it may vary based on ethnic identity, racial identity, religious, religion identification, socioeconomic status, ability, physical ability in some ways. And so for me, just recognizing that as a Black man, Haitian American, right, all of those things inform my masculine expression. And even some of the lessons or belief systems that I've internalized and hold on to that may vary from someone who may be a white person, cis or LGBTQ person.
Well, I think Nikki, go ahead, but I think a bunch of emojis with the head blowing up just happened with masculinities.
Yes, totally. Yeah, totally. No, and of course, Pete's gonna laugh at this, and Gene, I know you've listened to some of our episodes, so maybe you will too. It's like, of course, the word that came to my head is like dialectics everywhere. It's like dialectical. It's like, right? It's just so many dialectics, right? And acknowledging that there are going to be similarities and differences, and making space for all of those pieces to be curious and identify all of those and recognize it's not going to be the same across, again, I'll say it again, across contexts.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
do we want to go back to sort of like diving in a little bit?
Go deeper with I think what I'm hearing is it's the idea that society places pressure on men in this example. Well, are we only talking, so if we're thinking about gender, so hold on, I'm going to make sure I'm thinking about, because masculinity, this is the thing that might be helpful for listeners. It's not just male, female, and that's, so certainly in the Western world, we have made this, very binary. And so, let me ask you that. Is there space for fluidity as we talk about, and as you've, done all this work around toxic masculinity, is there space for fluidity between masculine and feminine?
Absolutely. I mean, I think a part of the work is to create that space and to break down those particular barriers. Because a part of the toxicity is the rigidity of it as well, right? It's this boxing in, forcing people to kind of adhere to particular characteristics just because we identify with certain things. So because I'm male identified and I align with that particular identification, that somehow that means I have to perform in these ways, right? But if it doesn't feel natural to me, then what tends to happen, unfortunately, is that we sort of police each other back into that box. Right? It's like almost the snipers set up at the roof to keep the, to keep the prisoners at bay and keep them confined and contained. And I think it's a similar thing, right? So, and that's unfortunately where we kind of get into the anti-feminine language, the homophobic or anti-LGBTQ language that comes about to kind of push men identified folks back into those boxes or to adhere to those particular characteristics or ways of being. But yeah, I mean, the purpose is to definitely break down and recognize that there is fluidity.
Well, and to move away, what I'm also really hearing is like moving away from rules and rule governed behavior, right? So it's cultivating, and I mean, obviously, this is sort of a synonym to fluidity is again the flexibility around it. And honestly, it's interesting. What was coming to my mind as you were speaking is I was imagining that there are probably, maybe there are some listeners, even if clicking on this episode or beginning to hear us have this discussion, thinking that like, why are we, and again, this is a general judgment narrative that exists in the world. Why are we talking about men? Like there's the patriarchy. Why are we talking about men? Why are we prioritizing men? And because I hear that, by the way, because I hear that from female patients sometimes. And it becomes a conversation I have with them. And obviously I'm a cis female in this conversation. And I think what's really important about what Gene is talking about in the work that you do, Gene, and I think you're beginning to sort of identify this, it's like these rule governed behaviors, it's not just about the impact on men or cis men, right? It's like the impact on I don't know, I'm going to get broad here, on humans, on functioning, right? That these rules are, do you agree with that, or am I sort of on the right track there? Yeah,
of course. Yeah, I think it's an impact. One, we want to recognize that when folks are impacted, especially when we're thinking about trauma work, right? But I'm impacted from my own trauma. I'm going to, in some ways, right, develop these particular coping strategies that are maladaptive, that are problematic, and I'm going to, in some ways, engage with folks from that particular place. And so I think with men, you know, there are a set of things that we internalize and abide by that are even just problematic for ourselves,
Yeah.
and then translate into our relationships and are super impactful in those particular areas. I mean, if we're looking at sort of just even suicide
Mm.
rates, if we're looking at just lack of access to mental health
Hmm.
services, not even talking about, well, medical services is what I meant,
Right.
not
Yeah.
even including mental health, but just medical services in general, going
Yeah.
to follow-ups, you know, things that sort. Like there's even just a lower percentage, or if we're talking about survivorship of sexual assault or interpersonal
Hmm.
violence, that there are men who also are victims of it as boys, and as adult males, but
Right.
don't
Yeah.
seek out services, don't report, don't discuss these particular things. So that's one portion of it. And then we're looking at other pieces of it when we're thinking about perpetration and just the gender identification who, of those who maybe are perpetrating particular crimes, right?
Mm.
When we're
Hmm.
looking at percentages in those particular areas. So I think on both ends, we're recognizing that there's a crisis, in my opinion,
Yeah.
Yeah.
that needs to be addressed, that needs to be acknowledged, and needs to be discussed. So I think earlier when we were talking about just masculinities, right, and just embodying that, that it's not just men, right, who kind of
Hmm.
internalize those
Yeah.
particular things, but it's everyone across
Yeah.
all genders who internalize what we believe a man should be and how they should
Hmm.
move and how they should interact. You
Well,
know,
it's like sometimes I'll say to Nikki, she's dressed like a tomboy, you know.
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah. I'm
but
just like that today, kind of actually. Yeah. Yeah.
but that feeds
That
into it. So I think
that's
what I'm
right.
also trying to
That's right.
model there is like we all have that story. You know, in psychology we might call that an implicit bias, and so I think it's just been such an amazing, at least for me as like an audience, kind of watching you grow professionally in this work. Can you maybe think of like a really powerful time or like a powerful group? You know, obviously we have confidentiality, so sometimes we can't speak specifically to the group or the moment, but maybe some, you know, for our listeners, like illustrating how this can actually impact others. If you can think of like a time that you could share.
no, absolutely. So I have, and I would say this doesn't even single out a client because so many of like my male identified clients come in and there's a similarity in existence. But one thing that stands out for me is just thinking about the expression of love,
Yeah.
Mm.
or
Mhm.
even
Yes.
affection
Yeah.
and communication of emotion. So
Hmm.
a lot of my male clients will say, you know, that's not what I grew up on, right? That wasn't my
Hmm.
household at all. And in
Hmm.
fact, right, I was suppressed or told, you know, kind of like shut the F up, you know,
Yeah.
Hmm.
man up,
Hmm.
suck it up, deal with it. What are you crying for? Right?
Yeah.
Hmm.
I'll give you something to cry about, which is
Yep.
usually a physical threat.
Right. Right.
Saying that whatever, you know, issue that wasn't physical isn't enough to particularly express or have a genuine emotional reaction to. So in turn, what tends to happen is that they're so disconnected
Yeah.
from emotional experiences that are happening before them within their partners or their kids that there's an intense reaction to that.
Yeah.
So when there's an expression of very authentic, justified emotions, right, based on something that they did, there's an intense reaction and result on their end because it's almost like, what's the big deal?
Mm.
Right? Like, what is the big deal? Like, why are we having this particular emotional expression? Is it necessary? Right? Then the engaging of minimizing. So they're so disconnected and
Yeah.
removed that even their empathic capacity is debilitated
Yeah.
in some ways, right? And that emotional intelligence in some ways is also stunted,
Totally.
Right.
right? And being able to
Right.
engage, yeah.
That honestly, it's like, and I can share, it's like, that is the thing. And I mean, it's such a, like, that breaks my heart. Like when you said that, when you
Yeah.
said like the expression of
You
love,
gonna
and
cry?
I'm a little teary actually, to be honest, when I'm talking about it. And I don't know if, I don't think Pete told this to Jean before, I'll share, and I'll clarify. Obviously, I'm not the expert here. I defer, graciously to Jean, but my dissertation was actually on adapting cognitive behavioral therapy for, at the time, I referred to it as a traditional masculine gender identity
Yeah.
with cisgender men, and the reason, obviously, I'm a cis woman. How I think the reason that always interested me was because it pains me so much to see
Yeah.
that those stories and those shoulds and those rules impact a human in that way. And that's like when I'm working with male identified patients, that's something I talk about all the time. I'll say, you're a human being,
Yeah.
you know, like, yes, you know, there are going to be differences in your biology and that's all true. I'm not denying that. And I was like, the stories that you're told, I'll say, are different than the stories that I'm told.
Yeah.
And you deserve to experience love just as much as I do and express it. And so I'm very, like, I'm so grateful that there is someone like you that's doing this kind of work. And especially and for Pete too, I would say, we need more male identified clinicians. Actually, that's another problem, is that there are, you know, we have a very cis female dominated field.
Well, there's another dialectic, because it started off as very white male dominant.
Well, that's right, that it did. And then the pendulum
swung to like primarily female. And so forget about like issues of ethnic or racial diversity and, you know, provider. The word that keeps coming to mind for me is vulnerability. So I can, you know, again, part of why I tapped into Jean and with some of the teams that I work with is just to really help to just, because sometimes I joke, I use humor and oh, stop.
No.
Call them on it.
Oh yeah. I own it. But I joke sometimes. I say, I feel like such a good psychologist sometimes around, you know, some of these men, because really once we could, like when we build trust and we can just teach a little bit of this, like they're able to go home and like connect with their partner in a more effective way, or they're able to ask open-ended questions, or, you know, and it is really rewarding. And I can't even get teary-eyed about it, Nikki, with you.
Yeah. See,
it does feel really good. So Jean, do you have like any tips or like, you know, kind of ways in which that you have found beneficial to help some people work through this?
I think one of the things that sticks out for me is, and I think it's just a general clinical practice, but just mirroring an appropriate emotional reaction to a particular situation.
Yeah.
So even as you talk about like joking, you know, I know for myself, some folks, like I can minimize the severity of an issue through jokes because of the discomfort that I'm experiencing by actually recognizing the severity of that particular issue.
Yeah.
So for a lot of my male clients, my male identified clients, it's just really in the times where I find that they want to go to a joke, you know, or that they want to minimize the severity, I stick with the emotional expression or the feeling of what's happening to kind of help get them to understand that it's okay to really feel the intensity, but not only is it okay, it's safe here to do so.
Yeah.
Because I think a part of it that happens is a dismantle of their safety, right? To say that I can safely go into an emotional place, and in some ways it doesn't impact my gender identification.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think one of the tips for me that I utilize and definitely would encourage people is just being able to model that. And I think what's even more impactful is when you have male identified clinicians doing that with other male identified clinicians.
That's what I always say. I'm like, the modeling. That's what I've like two people I can refer to, and I'm like, I was like, I want the modeling. I'm like, I can only model to a degree. You know what I mean? It's not the same.
Yeah, and sometimes we try and, just for listeners, like sometimes we try and connect gender, or, you know, there's mixed research around whether gender fit, racial fit, religious fit, if that works in therapy. So there's, you know, sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't, like a good dialectic like we talk about here.
Right. What I was gonna say, it's not a one size fits all, though it can definitely be helpful. I was wondering if we can maybe bring in, because I think what Jean's sharing is a nice segue into this, is like some of the Eastern stuff, because I'm really, you know, because I think, you know, Jean, tell me if I'm wrong. I think really what you're describing too is like a very mindful approach, right? Like inviting somebody into like the mindfulness of emotion in the moment and tolerating the discomfort. And I guess it's a question for both of you guys. Like, one, like, what are some of the additional maybe Eastern practices you weave in to target this, but also what does like Buddhism say about this?
Yeah, well, and that'll be a nice way to kind of bring this to a wrap too. But like maybe thinking about it, with your permission, Nikki, just spirituality in general. Like if Jean has found you know, space for spirituality in the practice.
So I think for me, in a lot of my mindfulness practice, I have to transparently say I've learned from Pete.
Shocker.
Just in case people didn't know. So I've definitely found like just value in grounding work. just getting folks to be able to be present with the here and now, but not just kind of subjecting it to this idea of just meditation or this traditional look or way of meditation, but just recognizing that activities can also be moments of meditation, and just being present and being connected with that particular thing before you. So I think that's one thing that I've kind of fallen to, where a lot of my male identified clients, there's a discomfort in doing a grounding exercise in the beginning of our session, but then because it's one of trust, right? It's I'm closing my eyes in front of you. I've never had a guy ask me to meditate or do a grounding exercise with him. So
it's intimate.
It's intimate. And probably it can feel very exposing and vulnerable.
Which is contrary to masculinity. Therapy is contrary to masculinity. It's this idea of exposing vulnerability, feeling, right? So I think that's one part of the reason why we don't find as many male identified clinicians within a work. But then I also think that's why probably therapy also acts as a barrier for a lot of men identified folks to access, because it's like, I'm going to go talk about my feelings for what, right?
It's the what's doesn't make sense. Like, what's the point?
It doesn't make sense.
Well,
this was well, we could obviously keep going.
Well, but can you say just a little bit what Buddhism says about any the concepts of masculinity, or I feel like there's maybe something to say.
Well, there's always something to say, Nikki, but we might be out of time, so it might just have to wait for another episode.
In the next episode.
Damn,
It's a cliffhanger, y'all.
It's a cliffhanger. I'm like, wait, I need to know more.
Well, you're always seeking knowledge, but Jean, I really appreciate you coming on today.
You.
This was really such a pleasure. And, you're doing such good work, and I am honored to get to know you and to be your friend and colleague.
No, absolutely. Thank you both for having me. And Pete, I love you. You're one of the greatest guys that I know. So thank you for constantly being there. So.
You say that to everybody. I love you too.
No, I don't. Trust me.
I know you do.
People will tell.
There's that masculinity thing.
Yeah.
I love you too. Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
This has been When East Meets West. I'm Dr. Pete Economo.
And I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin. Be present, be brave.
This has been When East Meets West. All material is based on opinion and educational training of Drs. Pete Economo and Nikki Rubin.
Content is for informational and educational purposes only.